Thank you so much for coming. It's a singular and a privilege and an honor for me to introduce this year's Dr. Meredith E. Drench Lecture. Before I get started introducing our speaker, I want to tell you a little bit about this, the person that we have to thank for this lecture. Meredith E. Drench was a PhD and a PT who established this lectureship, if I can say that, Sargent College's first endowed lecture series to share and to propagate her passion and belief in, quoting her, compassionate rehabilitation of the whole person. So I hope that each of you will, at some moment, for just a very brief moment, you don't want to miss too much, during the next hour or so, reflect on and appreciate Dr. Drench's vision for this afternoon's lecture, as this year's speaker is the absolute epitome of this passion and belief. Dr. Drench's work bridged the fields of physical rehabilitation and psychosocial behavioral sciences. Her efforts represented the very best of patient-centered care, even before patient-centered outcomes held such laser focus in healthcare. She was really a healthcare professional well ahead of her time. Each year, to honor her pioneering efforts in interprofessional practice, we invite a distinguished speaker to deliver an address on the psychosocial aspects of healthcare to our students and faculty and to the entire Boston University community. And again, before I introduce our speaker, I also want to thank our Sargent College Speaker Selection Committee members who are immediately responsible for this evening's lecture. And so if you could wave your hands out there, Linda Bandini, Jessica Kramer, Lee Marenko, and Christine Strand. I'm sure you're here, they're all over the place, but thank you so much for organizing this lecture and identifying our speaker tonight. They've contributed so much of their time and effort into making sure that this afternoon is informative and influential, as well as personally and professionally inspiring for all of us. So thank you to the committee members. So I'm extraordinarily pleased to introduce this year's Drench lecturer, Dr. Cheri Blauwet, MD. Prepare to be humbled. But then get past your introspection quickly, because you won't want to miss a moment of her talk. Dr. Blauwet is a graduate of Stanford University School of Medicine, and in addition to her day job as instructor in physical medicine and rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School, she's an attending physician at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Blauwet also serves as the Disability Access and Awareness Director for Spaulding Rehabilitation Network. But there's more. Dr. Blauwet is a Paralympic athlete in wheelchair racing, competing in 3 Olympics, winning 7 medals. She's also won the Boston and New York marathons twice each. Dr. Blauwet is tireless, don't choose that word lightly, advocate for the right to physical activity, to participation that includes physical activity and active lifestyles for all individuals with disabilities. It's my honor and privilege to introduce and to welcome the 2015 Meredith E. Drench Lecturer, Dr. Cheri Blauwet.
Thank you, Dean Moore. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, good. So the only caveat, thank you for the very kind introduction, and the only caveat is that that didn't all happen at the same time. So there were many years that spanned those moments in life and things that I've done over time. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. So I'm so humbled and privileged to be able to deliver the Drench Lecture this year. And the title of my talk is No Breaks, A Journey Towards Physical Activity for All. And this is really going to combine a lot of my own personal experiences as well as where I think, and we collectively, should look to the future towards access to physical activity for people of all backgrounds, ability levels, you name it. And first, of course, many thanks to the BU, Sargent College, to Dean Moore, to the memory, of course, of Meredith Drench, why we're all here today. Many thanks, of course, to her and her very thoughtful work over time and legacy with this lectureship. Of course, also many thanks to the folks that I work with every day over at Spaulding and the Department of PM&R at Harvard. And of course, all who have supported me in being here today. So to provide an overview, I'm first going to kind of recap a little bit about my own life and how I got to where I was as a person with a disability. I think that that does certainly color the conversation of where we are today and of my current work. I'm going to talk about my evolution into being an athlete, which didn't happen overnight. and I think has many examples of how the work that we do as rehabilitation professionals does lend towards opportunities for everyone. I know I was influenced by a lot of mentors over time, and we all in many ways are mentors to the patients we work with, to people in the community on a daily basis. Talk a little bit now about what I do in medicine, especially working within the Paralympic movement, working with athletes with disabilities from grassroots to elite, and about where we're heading in this exciting field. Talk a little bit about how the disability community does experience disparities when it comes to accessing physical activity. It's very important for everybody to move. We know there are CDC guidelines, the American College of Sports Medicine, many professional organizations that have great recommendations for what we need to do as active individuals to take care of ourselves and live healthy lifestyles. But people with disabilities don't always have access to these opportunities, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finish with a concept of how inclusive sports really can impact public health indicators. So, for example, something like the Paralympic movement and the Paralympic Games, which are a big, exciting event that occur every couple of years, thinking about how that actually might impact upon people's opportunities on a day-to-day basis. So that's our overview for today, and we'll get started. So, it all didn't begin glamorously, and I wasn't an athlete from day one. So I'm actually from the Midwest. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and I did experience a spinal cord injury when I was about 16 months old, so I was very young. I don't have any memory of it, and my early life, my earliest memories are of being a person with a disability. Now, because I lived in a fairly rural area, I didn't have a lot of other kids around me or young people who were just like me or who were also wheelchair users. Before I was old enough to have a chair, I had this little scooter that I used to scoot around the farm and get in lots of trouble and get really dirty. And who knows, these are a couple of my cousins and one of the farm cats that we had. And because I grew up in this environment, I think that did lead in many ways to an early mindset in which I really thought of myself just as any other kid. And because there weren't a lot of other kids with disabilities around, I learned to just adapt and do what I needed to do in order to play and have fun and go to school. So, that presented itself in many unique fashions, I think. My parents were fantastic about making sure that people didn't treat me differently. And, the title of the talk today is No Breaks. And that mindset or that construct was really, I think, formed very young by the people around me. And by no breaks, it's meant to have kind of a double meaning. So the first meaning, no breaks, as in B-R-A-K-E-S, just meant that, I truly feel that people with disabilities, even if they do require things like brakes on their wheelchair, which is perfectly fine, should always have the autonomy and always be empowered to make the decision on their own of when they do or do not want to use something like brakes and when they want to move forward or hold themselves back. All of that is appropriate at certain times in life, but it always should be up to the individual. The other meaning of no breaks, breaks as in B-R-E-A-K-S, is meant to signify that we as a disability community, we don't want expectations lowered for us, but rather we want the same expectations as anyone else out there, and then we rise up to meet them when accommodated and when given the right resources and opportunities. So that mindset, the embracing the concept of no breaks, I think started when I was very young. Now, as I got into elementary school and then middle school, I developed this mindset of being a very involved person. So I was very much a self-proclaimed nerd. I think nerds are the best. There might be a few in this room. So, I did well in school. I was in student council. I was in band. I was in the glee club. We didn't have a debate team, or I probably would have been on the debate team. But I was certainly without a doubt gearing towards and heading towards things that I knew that I could do that didn't necessarily push me at a physical level. And so I remember frequently that the people around me, without meaning to be in any way stigmatizing, would often say the phrase, well, you should do the things you can be good at. And they said that in a way that was meant to be encouraging. Student council is an easy thing for you to do, Cheri. You'd be good at that. You should do that. You sit at a table and you talk and you write on papers and you make proclamations to the student body. Something that any person who's a wheelchair user should be able to do quite well. Now, at the time, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, I understand that I started to, in some ways, self-segregate a little ways, or in some regards, into the things that I knew wouldn't require a lot of physical ability or skill. And again, everyone's going to approach that concept from a different place. We all have different physical abilities and physical limitations. But for me, I do think that I was, without meaning to, starting to kind of segregate myself into things that did not challenge me in a physical way. And that all changed very quickly when I was in 8th grade. So I firmly believe that so much of what we believe we can do when we're young is imparted by the adults and the role models we have around us. So when I was in 8th grade, our high school track coach tracked me down in the hallway. Now this was a small Midwest high school. I had about 70 people in my class, so it was easy to find me. Everybody knew everybody. And he found me in the hallway, and he tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, Cheri, you know, I just saw this thing called wheelchair racing. Do you want to give it a try? Well, initially I thought he was crazy because I was already busy in all of my other activities, and I had never for even a moment thought that I would ever be an athlete. That had never crossed my mind. I didn't see myself in that way. And at the time, I'm pretty sure I said something like, oh, thanks, coach, great idea, I'm cool. No thanks, and probably wheeled the other way down the hallway. Now, because it was such a small school, because he could track me down, he kept bringing it up every time he'd see me in the hallway or in gym class. And also in this school, the track coach is the English teacher, is the coach of several other sports. People wear multiple hats. And so I ran into him a lot, and he kept bringing it up. And then little did I know it, but also small town, he talked to my parents, and then I'd get home, and then they would keep bringing it up. And everybody really wanted me very fervently to give this sport a try. So about a year later, and I was now a freshman in high school, and it was March or so, and they announced over the loudspeaker, well, track practice will begin next Monday, go to the gym at 4 o'clock to pick up your uniform. And I had this sense of angst deep within me because I knew that there were so many people that wanted me to try this sport, but I was really, really nervous about it and really anxious. And I honestly didn't really want to do it because I knew it would make me stand out and look different. The following week, when that day rolled around, almost to just appease all those people who I didn't want to let down, I showed up for practice and I got a uniform. In that season, I was on the track team and I started going to practices, pushing laps around the track while other people literally ran circles around me. And it wasn't that much fun, but I stuck with it. And we would go to the regional track meets in the area, and they would always have a couple of events, the 100 and 400 meter wheelchair race, because that was what the state of Iowa had kind of designated as the exhibition level events. And I would do those events, and I was usually the only competitor, so I would be at the start line, and they would shoot the gun, and I'd push down the track, and everybody in the stands would do like the golf clap, oh, that's so nice. And I'd get to the finish, I was only racing myself. And as you can imagine, for a freshman in high school, this really was not that much fun. And by the end of the season, I was ready to throw in the towel, without a doubt. The last opportunity for that season was to go to the state track meet. And for these exhibition wheelchair racing events, there weren't that many people participating across the state, so anyone could race them. So along with all the other people on my team who qualified for the state meet, I accompanied them and went to Des Moines for this event. And when we got there, things changed very quickly because I rolled out onto the track, and being from our tiny town in northwest Iowa, I had no idea, but that day I met several other teenage girls who were also people with disabilities who were racing track, and they had track chairs, the real thing. And they knew what they were doing, and they knew about this sport called wheelchair racing. And there was a team, and they were all part of this team that trained in Des Moines. So met these peers, and instantaneously was hooked because I wanted to get to know them better, and I wanted to be friends. So met these other athletes and learned that there was a wheelchair racing team that practiced on Saturdays in Des Moines, and started to commit to going to those practices. It was about 4 hours one way. So we'd get up about 4 in the morning, and my parents would drive me to Des Moines for practice at 9 to noon, and then we'd drive back to northwest Iowa. And initially what kept me involved was wanting to be friends with the other girls in the team, not love for the sport at all. But I stuck with it because of those friendships, like many other teenage athletes do, and that really led me to learning more about the sport and ultimately being decent at the sport. So also along the lines of the importance of simply telling young people that you believe in them, my sports career really took a turn when I was a junior in high school. So I had stayed involved, again, because of those friendships. And I had started to train and compete regionally and then nationally. And at a national level meet my junior year, they had decided that they were going to name 5 guys and 5 girls to be on this developmental team to go to one of the U.S. Olympic training centers for a couple weeks and learn the ropes from some of the pros in the sport. And I had no expectation at all that I would be selected for this, but at the end of that event, when they listed the names over the loudspeaker, I was one of them. I was very surprised, but ultimately found myself in San Diego at the Olympic Training Center in Chula Vista with 10 other young people who had also had this opportunity. And suddenly I realized that maybe if I even didn't believe in myself quite yet, there were people on the team, coaches on the U.S. team, who thought that I could do this and do it at a really high level, which completely turned around my own concept of my ultimate potential in sports. So from that moment forward, it was kind of game on, because suddenly I realized almost overnight that I could have a future in this sport and it could be something big. And even being in the environment of the training center really lit the fire within me to want to give this a shot. So several years down the road, in 2000, I qualified for my first Paralympic Games and then continued to compete on the U.S. team in Sydney, Athens, and Beijing, bringing home a total of 7 medals, 1 gold, which I have here today, which we can pass around later. It's real. And so much of that was because of these people along the way who simply told me they believed in me and told me that they think I could do it. And not only, you know, saying, I think you can do this, but actually I know you can do this and I have those high expectations of you. And if you don't give this a shot, you might never know what your capabilities were. So much of it was about those mentors early on. In addition to competing in the Paralympics, had the opportunity to race many marathons across the country and some across the world. Boston was always incredibly important to me. It was obviously a very historic marathon. It was one of the first to open its doors to athletes with disabilities back in the 1970s, before it was expected or popular to do such a thing. They really did forge the trail. And for that reason, it was always a pleasure to come to Boston. In 2003, I raced my first marathon here. I came in runner-up, which was not okay. It was a good day, but not good enough. So came back in 2004, and I knew it was going to be a big race. The conditions were perfect. For those of you who lived in Boston at the time, you might remember it was a very hot year, which is I loved. I loved it when the temperatures were warmer. And my whole strategy for the race was to try to stick with that main pack down the hills. It's a net downhill course until about mile 19. So for the wheelchair racers, it's a very fast course. And then you turn a right-hand corner in Newton, right by the fire station, and then you start to pound your way up the hills, including Heartbreak Hill. Heartbreak Hill is a misnomer. It's hills. It's plural. Heartbreak Hills. Till about mile 23, and then you flatten out and bring it down into the back bay to finish. So that year, in 2004, I knew that I was having a good year. I knew that I was on the top of my game. And I knew that if I could stick with the pack to the bottom of the hills in Newton, that I would have a good chance of maybe bringing home a win because I was a really good climber. So I was with the pack. We turned that right corner, and I just let it loose and climbed the hills, giving it 110% for that period of time. And when I got to the top of the hills, I looked back, and there was no one behind me. And I knew at that moment that this might actually happen. I don't really even remember much of those next few miles. I was just going so hard, so fast. And when I turned the corner to take that left onto Boylston Street, I again looked back. I thought there was especially a couple of Swiss racers who I knew were really, really strong. And I was expecting to see them kind of in the rearview mirror, but I didn't. And I had that last half mile to kind of bask in the fact that I was about to win this. And brought it home, and then came back in 2005 to have the same opportunity and to win it again. So this was definitely life-changing for me. It brought my sports career to a new level. Had so much to do with the history and the notoriety of the marathon here in Boston, and so many people in town to be thankful for that opportunity. So along the way, you know, clearly had some amazing experiences, was very honored and blessed to compete for the US team. But ultimately, to me, what I loved about it was, of course, the excitement of competition, but also the fact that what we were doing meant so much more. And I love this image that comes from a website called the Olympism Project, where they kind of blend the rings to be kind of one figure, just signifying the fact that why we do this all is to create unity and to bring ourselves together through sports. And this is a quote from the Olympic Charter that talks about that the sports are meant to be practiced without discrimination and under the premise of friendship, solidarity, fair play. That's why we're all there. And that's why I loved this opportunity and was always so honored to compete as a U.S. Paralympian within the Olympic and Paralympic movement. So in parallel with this, there was this academic thing also. And so as I was competing, I stayed in school and continued to move forward and had, in some ways, parallel lives, but ones that I think played very, very well together and really accentuated one another. So obviously graduated high school when I was about 18, and I was competing. That was right before I qualified for my first Paralympics. So because sports were such a big part of my life at that time, I wanted to go somewhere where I knew that I would have adequate opportunities to train and be a part of a team. And so I chose the University of Arizona, which at the time had pretty good club sport level adaptive sports, wheelchair racing being one of them. They also had basketball, quad rugby, and a few others. And at the time, we were, as I said, a club level sport. We weren't part of the NCAA program at the university, which is starting to change, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But it was still a fantastic opportunity to train, of course, with teammates on a daily basis, have coaching on a daily basis, and that really catapulted my sports career. After undergrad, of course, moved on, as you all know by now, to medical school. Stayed on the West Coast because it also offered great training. And because by that time, sports had really opened my eyes to the world. This one opportunity had really given me a new world view towards what would be possible. And so much of my decision to move forward in a career in medicine, to even go to medical school, although I may not have realized it at the time, I think was supported by my sports career, because I began to meet athletes from all corners of the world and understand more about, you know, their journey and the challenges they faced along the way, and the way in which they likely had to change a lot of minds and hearts even before having the opportunity to be an athlete, to compete for their national team. And about how ongoing discrimination and ongoing lack of opportunity not only impacts someone's ability to play sports, but it certainly impacts their health on a much larger level. So these endeavors were really intertwined, and you know, there was never a time in which I would have said, well, I'm not going to play sports or I'm not going to go to school anymore. So I did them both together. I did take a few leaves and took extra time to complete med school. The photo on the right here is from some light research work that I did in Uganda as a med student that looked at doing interviews with kids, talking about, as they were getting involved with the sports program, talking to them a little bit about what it meant to them. And so many of them, the common themes that came out of that were that, you know, they loved sport, they loved being a part of it, but they just loved showing people what they could do, because it was so hard to have that opportunity otherwise. So as I was finishing competition and going through med school, I retired from competing for the US team in 2008. And that was about the time I finished med school then in 2009. So these were kind of coming to a culmination at once. And moved to Boston to do residency in physical medicine and rehab. And at that same time, as I was competing and moving through school, the Paralympic movement was growing by leaps and bounds. And this is just one figure that shows athlete participation in the Summer and Winter Games. This is a very, very young thing. The first official Paralympic Games were said to have been in Rome in 1960, with the Winter Games shortly thereafter in the 70s kind of getting kicked off. And these figures are really definitely underestimate the amount of people that are participating, because the Games is always capped, and of course each country can only bring a certain number of athletes. So For growth, the growth chart for the games participation, I think multiply it times 10 for the growth chart of just participation at the community level. And so it became clear to me that as I was moving from being an athlete to a career in medicine and taking that experience with me, and alongside the growth of the Paralympic movement, that there would be an amazing opportunity here. And I'm really working to shape my career now around sports medicine, which is what I do on a daily basis, but focusing on Paralympic athletes or athletes with disabilities, not just elite athletes, but at all levels. And the rationale for the development of this field, I think, is very exciting and kind of undeniable in many ways. And these are some of the reasons. So athletes with disabilities, if you look at sports medicine services for athletes even on their national teams, this is still very much an underserved group of athletes. And a lot of physicians, athletic trainers, people in the community, probably not as many in this room, but just more broadly speaking, I think in some ways fear working with this population. If I talk to, there might be some of the best sports medicine doctors, most experienced people out there that are very revered in the field, but I think a lot of them, if you talk to them, feel like, oh, well, that's kind of a different ball game. I'm not sure that I can work with those athletes because there is still that stigma that these athletes are more fragile or that they might have more medical problems, which in some cases might be true to some extent, but it doesn't mean they don't need services, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't figure out how to provide competent care. This is extremely interesting work because it really blends rehab medicine, physical medicine and rehab with sports performance, sports medicine. And it's really been interesting to think about, how one's background of having an impairment to begin with then blends with how they're going to perform in a sport and how we can keep athletes healthy and prevent injury along the way. And finally, last but not least, and something I think is extremely important, is just that the more people we get moving, the better we are as a population. And everyone's going to have different abilities, and that's fine. And that's the interesting part, is thinking creatively about how we create opportunities for all. So currently, I practice general sports medicine at the Brigham, and that's all comers, everything from 18-year-old soccer players to 80-year-old folks who still want to go on weekend jogs and their knees hurt and their hips hurt. And so we do a lot with regards to, just keeping people up and moving, which is what I love about it. And then in my role at Spaulding, it's really unique and I think a great opportunity because we're able to combine what we do with our adaptive sports programming and really think about how to add a clinical element to that, which is what we're doing now. We're about to kick off an adaptive sports medicine clinic that'll probably be once every couple weeks on a Saturday. That's interdisciplinary, where we have a physician presence, but then also several of our therapists and also equipment specialists so that we can look at athletes in their sports equipment, learn more about what injuries may be holding them back, and then how we can think about treating the injury but also preventing further symptoms from a biomechanical standpoint. So it's that intersection, again, that I think is really interesting. Currently I have the opportunity to work at an international level with the International Paralympic Committee, and this has been something that has been an amazing experience. Working with this group of people here on the left that come from an international background and thinking about Paralympic athletes more at the policy level and what we need to do as a movement in order to keep athletes up and running and competing in a safe way. So some of the things we do are setting standards for sports medicine services. Often the countries that put their name in the hat to host events. So a great example would be, say that you were in Poland and you wanted to host the IPC World Sled Hockey Championships. So what would you have to do in order to provide medical services at that event to these athletes who are coming from around the world? And until only a few years ago, there actually weren't any standards around that at all, which was a big miss. And so, doing things like developing the policy around what we need to do to ensure safe and fair play is really important. We look at the concept of therapeutic use exemptions. So that's within an anti-doping program. When you have athletes who are at the national level, they usually have to take part in drug testing. But certain athletes need certain medications that might be on the prohibited list, but they still need them. And so those athletes then typically apply for what we call a TUE that certifies that they can take that, and even if they test positive for it, it's okay because they had previously filed exemption for it. We run a longitudinal injury and illness surveillance study, which I think is very interesting and helps us to track injuries that are occurring at the games so that we know if there's any particularly areas of high risk or things that we could do better to keep athletes healthy when they're at the games themselves. And then we do a lot of education around injury prevention. A great example is that many in the room are probably familiar with is athletes who are wheelchair users on a daily basis, but then also compete in a sports wheelchair basketball, track and field, you name it. You know, what do we do to educate those athletes when they're still quite young about shoulder injury prevention so that when they're 60, they're still up and running and living a healthy life? And that's a super important question and something that we continue to look at both through the surveillance study but also from an educational standpoint. So this is work I really love and something that's, I think, have been a unique gift from the standpoint of wearing that athlete hat and then moving into sports medicine world. So at the end of the day, we return to this concept of no breaks. And ironically, I didn't use breaks when I was an athlete. So actually, I had them on my chair when I was very young. And then when I joined the track and field team, I actually got a lot of flack for it because there were all these older athletes that they looked at my chair. I was the newbie, and they're kind of like, "Yeah, nice breaks." And I said, "Okay, fine. I guess I need to take them off." So I took them off. And through most of my athletic career, I didn't use them. I actually didn't even have any on my chair because I could typically kind of hold it with my hands. And then when I retired from competing and I started residency, I actually, again, had that feeling of angst because I started to have this feeling that maybe I should put them back on, but I didn't want it to, you know, seem like I was kind of giving in. And then I came around full circle and I said, you know, actually, there's nothing wrong with that at all. You need them now. And I use them all the time for things like doing procedures as a physician. So at the end of the day, once again, it comes back to the point that as long as we get to decide for ourselves, there's nothing wrong with it either way. And the autonomy is the most important concept to keep in mind. So that was a bit about my personal story and a little bit about how I got to where I am and the lens that I have now. But I wanted to kind of open it up to the broader the bigger picture with regards to how this Paralympic movement, my experience as an athlete, is just one example of what we can do to translate that then to more opportunities for everyone we work with. So just a few facts and figures. You probably heard about the WHO World Report, which came out in 2011, which was one of the biggest sort of international papers, white papers, talking about what we knew from evidence and how that should translate into practice to create optimal health for the disability community. And of course, that notes that our disability population it's really big. It's a huge minority group, at least 15% people globally, and growing because of our aging populations, chronic disease, et cetera. And you know, an interesting thing, of course, is it's a minority group that people can enter and exit or enter and stay. But that's what makes it unique and different than other minority groups. And the Institute of Medicine put out a great report called The Future of Disability in America in 2007. And I just love this quote that disability affects now, or excuse me, today, or will affect tomorrow the lives of most Americans. So it affects everybody. No one has the ticket to kind of ignore this from my perspective. And then we bring into that the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health from the WHO in 2011. And again, this is obviously was a big statement coming out that said that, well, disability isn't just someone's diagnosis, but rather it's how they interact with their environment. So all these external factors like socioeconomic status and access to the community, ramps, curb cuts, accessible parking, all of these things impact health when you think about health more broadly. So the ICF was so good for the disability community because it helped us to redefine and bring ourselves out of more of a medical model and rather think about disability as something that's largely impacted by the environment. So as it relates to physical activity, I'd like to ask the question, well, how are we doing now in serving the needs of our disability population? And one thing I'd like to bring up is that part of the challenge here is it's a very heterogeneous population. So it's everything from a young guy with a spinal cord injury who might be a wheelchair tennis player or a quad rugby player to our aging population who acquire disability over time. to younger weekend warriors like the guy in the bottom row who might have a little bit of mild knee arthritis, is starting to get held back a little bit, but doesn't consider himself disabled by any means. It could be a younger woman with more significant cerebral palsy, for example, who also needs opportunities to access physical activity. So when we talk about the disability community, part of the question is, well, what do we mean by that? And are we really meant to try to figure out the solution for all these people? It's a good question. I think one that we have yet to answer, but I'll present some comments that I think, or concepts that I think are helpful. So if we look at what our goal should be, we have good physical activity guidelines. These are the most recent from the CDC that are supported by a lot of other professional associations, et cetera. And that is that adults should get 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity every week. And then that's kind of the basis. And then it goes on to talk about strength training, balance and proprioception, and several other areas of goals that we should meet in order to have optimal health. So, you know, that can be seen as a somewhat lofty goal. And for aerobic activity, it goes on to say that, well, 150 minutes is the base. And then the more the better of this moderate intensity physical activity. Better if you break it up into multiple sessions over the week rather than doing it all at once and so on. So, you know, good guidelines to live by. But the question then is, well, what if you're a person with a disability? Are those guidelines the same? Should they be the same? And I think it's easy to see that if you're working through mobility limitations or access limitations, when you're trying to access that exercise, that it can be much harder to meet that 150-minute mark. So these are some great numbers. This is from, the main author was Barbara Altman from the National Center for Health Statistics, and this came out in 2008, but it was numbers from a survey from 2001 to 2005. And it's a huge report, and this is just some things that I pulled out on a few things that I knew would be of interest, namely BMI, leisure time physical activity, and also cigarette smoking, because health behaviors also, I think, are very important to take note of. So if you look at a BMI, for example, and you look at individuals who self-declare as having no disability versus those who either have movement difficulty, emotional difficulty, sensory difficulty, or cognitive, you'll see that people with any type of disability are far more likely to fall within the overweight or obese categories. And then if you go one row down to leisure time physical activity, you'll see that they're far less likely to get regular physical activity. Again, this is all self, survey in which the people are filling out on their own, but definitely a general indicator of the fact that we tend to be have more issues with overweight and obesity, and also don't move quite as much. And then similarly with cigarette smoking. I know that we have folks in the audience who have looked at this extensively, but we do know that folks with disabilities do have a higher likelihood of being smokers, which of course impact health and impact likely one's ability to engage in exercise as well. So this all ties in together and just is one example of the disparities that we know are very real for the disability community. If you look at just a few more quick stats about chronic non-communicable disease, with regards to obesity, there was a great paper in JAMA that talked about the fact that physicians are less likely to counsel patients with disabilities on the importance of exercise. There are probably a lot of reasons for this, whether they be sort of subtle stigma that we have, whether there's less time because there's just more to talk about in general during one short appointment. Hard to say, but definitely the case that people are less likely to even be advised on physical activity. We know that adults with intellectual impairment particularly are at a higher risk for being obese. That's in both supervised and independent living settings, and this is one paper, but there are many that show that that is definitely the case. As it relates to cardiovascular disease, there's some interesting papers coming out about the fact that if you look at someone who is obese, either with or without a disability, those who have mobility impairment are more likely to have other markers of cardiovascular disease. So there's something about the interaction between being obese but also being immobile, particularly with the lower extremities, that makes one more likely to have what we call this metabolic syndrome, where you acquire things like coronary atherosclerosis and are higher likelihood for things like heart attacks, et cetera. And we know that, again, just another example, but within the spinal cord injury population, that cardiovascular disease is sort of starting to trump other more historic causes of morbidity and mortality, things like skin breakdown and kidney dysfunction, et cetera. So even for those with kind of what we think about as a classic disability, a spinal cord injury, cardiovascular disease is becoming more and more of a problem. So across our populations, we know this is an ongoing challenge, and we know that disparities exist to people's access to that activity in the first place. And then also important to mention, I think that socioeconomic status and social determinants of health, as we call them, certainly impact upon people's ability to be active. So we know that more individuals with disabilities are unemployed and live below the poverty line as one marker of having challenges as it relates to financial independence and having just, income that you could use to then engage in physical activity. And we know through lots of good work, particularly by Jim Rimmer, who some may know in this room, that lower socioeconomic status is correlated with less physical activity for many different reasons. So once again, kind of one more hurdle for the disability community when we think about getting people active and engaged. So that's kind of dismal, right? It's kind of depressing. So we know that there's a disparity here. We know we have a lot of work to do. We have this Paralympic movement, which seems like a sort of pie-in-the-sky dream for a few elite athletes. But how do we think about making these concepts and these opportunities universal for everyone? How do we use something like the Paralympic movement to then transfer opportunities to all? And I'd like to talk a bit about that now. And I'd like to frame it in the concept of universal design. So this is really something that the disability community is pushing as a key concept moving forward on all different areas, certainly applicable to physical activity. And it's really an overarching concept that talks about thinking about design as being usable by the widest range of people without having to think about retrofitting it later on or adding extra expense because you have to put a ramp in 5 years after you've built the building, for example. And it applies to places and built infrastructure, but also tools, policies, our social attitudes, et cetera. So this ramp is just one shining example of universal design in which you see that anyone can access this building. People have the ability to choose whether you want to use the ramp or the stairs. They flow together seamlessly. It's very aesthetically pleasing. It clearly was planned that way from day one. And this is just one example of how universal design can be carried out very, very seamlessly. So when we think about physical activity, I'm just going to provide a few examples. There are many more. If we think about universal design in quote-unquote places, so this certainly applies to our built infrastructure in the places that people go to obtain physical activity. And I'd like to pose the question, if you think about the gym you go to on a daily basis, like how accessible is it really truly? They might have a ramp, they might have a larger bathroom stall. But if you think about the spaces between the machines, if you think about just the machines that are available to use or the classes you can take, how many of those are open to people of varied types of disabilities? And you probably begin to recognize that options may be limited. And that's absolutely the case. So as it relates to what we think about as standards, many have probably heard of the US Access Board, which creates standards that are meant to kind of implement the tenets of the ADA. And the Access Board has done a little bit with regards to fitness facilities, but not quite enough. We need to definitely keep lobbying for more guidelines. You can go to adachecklist.org, and there's a few guidelines there with regards to what could be applied to just any mainstream gym. And it's things like making sure that there's adequate space between the machines, the cardiovascular fitness machines, so that people can access them. But of course, it can go far beyond that. One example that falls within the realm of universal design and quote-unquote things, which is the tools that we use, would be, what if every gym had both a lower body and an upper body spin class? So there's this thing called the crank cycle. I don't hold any stock in it, but it is a great tool. And how innovative would it be if all the 24-hour fitnesses in the country had both a spin class and a crank class? And people anyone could pick which they wanted to do on any given day. And I would bet you that if that were the case, that some people would totally choose to do the upper body workout and then the next day the lower body workout and alternate them because it just makes sense for everybody. But it would also make the opportunities for group fitness classes much more universal for all. With something like this particular tool, the seat, the seat is there. You can either take it off completely and stand. You can take it off completely and pull up in a wheelchair. You can leave it there and kind of balance your weight on it if you have poor balance control or poor proprioception, for example. It just offers options, and that is a great example of how we could do better across the board at our YMCAs and our Bally's and all of the above with regards to fitness facilities. Universal design also applies to policies, and I think that's very important to mention. So over time, we've had some great examples of policy that have touched upon physical activity in sports and have gotten us to a pretty good place. So the Rehab Act, of course, was our first big piece of disability rights legislation back in the 70s, and that made it such that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of disability for any publicly funded facilities, programs, et cetera. And then, of course, the ADA came along in 1990, 25 years ago. This is the anniversary, which broadened that to also apply to some private facilities as well, things like just your privately owned restaurant, for example, and made it such that, if a new gym was built, it certainly should have the basics of those ADA regulations in place. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1990 hastened forward this concept of an individualized education program, which is meant to also apply to gym class or to physical activity. And in many states, it formed the creation of what we call adaptive PE teachers, which go beyond, are you in? Which go, oh, thank you. Which go, I thought you were saying you were in the past, which go, amongst schools to create inclusive opportunities to access that opportunity. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was a United Nations convention in 2006, and it did include as one of its main articles the right to sports, recreation, and several other tenets of just day-to-day life. And this made it so that sports wasn't an afterthought, but internationally a critical element of the disability rights movement, which was really important. And then the Department of Education in 2013 put forth what they called a Dear Colleague letter, which essentially just meant to clarify that all of those inclusive education opportunities, by the way, were meant to include sports, even from when the Rehab Act was first passed back in 1973, although in many schools, of course, it's not implemented. So we have more legal backing now than we ever have. It just needs to be known and be implemented at our public schools. There's been recent, really exciting news coming from the Eastern Collegiate Athletic Conference, which, of course, is right here at home in New England, where just a couple of months ago, they passed an inclusive sports strategy, which is going to make it so that for the first time ever, there will be inclusive sports opportunities at the collegiate NCAA level, which is really exciting. Lot yet to be determined in terms of which sports and how that will look, but it's pretty comprehensive, and it's meant to include both disability-specific sports, for example, potentially intercollegiate wheelchair basketball, as well as individual sports through which athletes can easily integrate, like track and field or swimming. And both of those types of opportunities are included. So more to come on that, but really exciting progress. So ultimately, it's all about changing the paradigm and starting to think of ourselves and imparting on people a sense of the fact that regardless of what type of disability you have, we can change the paradigm and change society's expectations, really embracing those concepts of universal design. It doesn't have to be difficult if we just take a step back and think creatively about how to create opportunities. With regards to sports acting as a catalyst, if we think about athletes' programs and platform, I think that there's a lot we can do. I'm going to flash this up real quickly again just to show that as these numbers continue to improve or continue to increase, we're going to have more opportunities for individual athletes, developmental opportunities that are meant to kind of fill that quote-unquote pipeline of ultimate potential U.S. Paralympians. If you look at our numbers on the team, it's remained pretty stable. We were 6th in the medal count in London, which we wanted to be higher. That usually nobody is happy with 6th if you're from the United States. And so with that, we have a lot of expansion of programs to try to develop young athletes and create that opportunity for people to ultimately compete for their country. This comes through Paralympic Sport Clubs, which is a program through the USOC, a lot of military programs and national federations that can create those parallel opportunities. And ultimately, at the athlete level, the goal is to increase participation and then ultimately medals. And we have to recognize that that is a motivator to some people. We all want that altruism to shine through, but at the end of the day, some people are really interested in the medal count. So the next steps, I think, from the athlete development standpoint is really the schools, really implementing that Department of Education guidance from 2013 and going to our schools and saying, well, actually, inclusive education means sports too. So we got to think together about how to make that happen. The MIAA here in Massachusetts is making a lot of progress recently. They're going to roll out more events in track and field this year for athletes with mobility impairment, but also visual impairment, for example. So we just got to keep pushing. There are great groups doing great work, but we need more widespread opportunity. And again, it all goes back to that DOE guidance. With regards to programs, there's more that we can do from the standpoint of Paralympic sport and using it as a platform for public health promotion. These are just a few examples of what we're doing now, but it's not very comprehensive, and I wanted to provide the comparison of actually the Special Olympics Healthy Athletes, Healthy Communities program, which uses Special Olympic events as a public health platform and voice to then create opportunities. So some of the things they do, for example, are educate local health professionals on the needs of athletes with intellectual impairment and how you can basically just provide competent primary care services. They also do health screening at their events. So this is a great example. There's key differences between the Paralympic movement and the Special Olympic movement, which all athletes will tell you. But at the end of the day, they do provide a good example of how you can use a big organization and a big event to do good things at a more of a public and community health level. Some ideas for what we could do at the Paralympic level would be use of athlete health ambassadors, thinking about USOC training resources for health providers, for example, using that Paralympic platform to kind of spread those messages because people tend to open an ear when they hear about Olympic and Paralympic sport. Having clinics and training sessions at major games would be really innovative. Creating more links between the Paralympic movement and the WHO so that when things like the World Report come out, it's always inclusive of sport and physical activity. And then supporting more research on health outcomes and how people do, if they're involved in sports when they're young, how do they do 30 years down the road? Are they healthier or not? And why? And how do we, again, create those opportunities for injury prevention? And finally, just wanted to talk a bit about that platform, kind of opening it back up to the more theoretical, but I think really important part of the conversation. And it's important to look, if you look at the mission statements of the IPC and the USOC, they both talk about achievement, inspiration, about how this big sporting event is actually meant not to just create opportunities for medals, even though that is in their interest at the end of the day, but also to provide more grassroots opportunities for all. And when you think about inspiration, I'd just like to make the point that athletes are inspiring, period. Billie Jean King in women's sports, Jackie Robinson in baseball, Casey Martin in the PGA Tour, and Johan Koss is a speed skater who pushed forward to start an organization called Right to Play, which uses sports for peace building. And so athletes can be inspirational, including Paralympic athletes. This is a Paralympian, Alexandro Zanardi, who won hand cycling in London. He was a Formula One driver who got in a big accident and experienced bilateral amputations and then went on to be a Paralympic athlete and win gold for Italy. So athletes are inspirational for their determination, their grit, their achievement, their dedication to their sport. And I'd like to say that the best athletes are role models regardless of disability. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts about what we can do with something like the Paralympic movement. Nike's slogan is to bring innovation and inspiration to every star athlete in the world. And the asterisk is meant to implement that if you have a body, you are an athlete. I love that quote, because I think it's true. No matter how you achieve it, no matter how you move, you still can be an athlete. They developed this all-terrain sole that's meant to go on the bottom of a running prosthesis, which was pretty innovative, so that athletes who use these types of prosthesis can not only run on the track, but also on trails and wherever they want to go. So at the end of the day, sports, I think, can truly be transformative at the individual level, athlete level, in terms of programming and in terms of shifting that paradigm. We know that health disparities are real, but when we think about the lens of universal design, we really can do a lot. And it all starts with one dream and us working with people one-on-one and telling them that we know and think and are going to work with them to reach their goals. So with that, I thank you, and I do have some references if people are interested. And thank you. I think we have time for a little Q&A, and I'll also be here after. Yeah.
So there are microphones, so raise your hand and wait for a microphone if you would.
Thanks.
Hi. Really liked your speech, and I wish my husband was here so I could explain why I hate it when he puts my brake on when he doesn't tell me.
There you go.
So I was an athlete, and then I had a spinal cord injury, and then 7 years of stuff. And so I've had 5 surgeries in 4 years, and I have an unusual injury because I have a right arm that doesn't work, and then so sometimes a wheelchair, sometimes I can't use crutches, and I have a Rubik's Cube of stuff I can do and stuff I can't. But I ended up finding a sport I could do, so I became the only disabled whirling dervish ever in the world.
Nice.
But how do you deal with my issues has been coordinating care. So I have a knee surgeon, I have a spinal surgeon, I have a neuro person. I used to have a TBI and that healed probably from dancing. But I have doctors that conflict with me to say I can or can't do something. Many of the doctors would have given up on me and said, just live on morphine and don't move. Yeah. Many for a couple years. Yeah. So how do you deal with the fact that, especially when I'm not mobile, I don't have enough time in a day to go to all the places they would want me to go, to coordinate all 4 surgeries except the first one were a result of PT. So I got hurt during PT, every single one since the original surgery. So how do you get it all in one place? That's been my big challenge.
Right. Well, I think that's a very, very real challenge for a lot of people. And I think that healthcare in general is too fragmented right now. And I think that's a reality that we've all run into in many ways. But when you're, working to be active with a background of some things that make that a little bit more complex, it can be a real challenge. I think places where, I'm obviously a bit biased, but working with folks like physicians who have a rehab background can be very helpful to coordinate some of that care and to think about it from a whole person perspective, because it is a reality that in working with some specialties, people will tend to compartmentalize issues. And that's okay to do when there's just one to deal with, but when it becomes more complex, it can be overwhelming. So I think, we would be happy to work with you from the standpoint of this new clinic we're developing, for example. And integrated care can be really helpful because, your knee is your knee, but that's just one part of, and that's just one part of how, optimizing all those different components and creating a package of how you best maintain mobility is the most important part of it. But
I just want to mention, she mentioned curb cuts. I'm in law school getting a PhD essentially in patent law because I have a lot of inventions that I had to figure out because I needed them. But there's a curb cut on St. Mary's that prevents me from getting to law school. So I wish someone would fix that. People look at the curb cuts and they think they're not important, but I could get to law school by myself if it wasn't for one curb cut on St. Mary's. So those of you that aren't in a wheelchair, it's a bummer.
Yeah. Well, let's take note of that curb cut.
Thank you.
Hi. I don't know if this is... Hello? Okay. So I'm one of the 4th-year medical students down at the medical campus. I'm going into child neurology over the next several years. And one of the things that I'm going to be facing a lot over my career are parents who have a child who has either been injured just from birth or at some point in childhood. And the question always comes up, well, what is my child going to be able to do? And there's this dilemma of balancing, realistic expectations with high expectations, and it's a really hard conversation to have, especially sort of with the babies when you can see sort of, I've seen imaging of some of the most devastating brains where they're just totally fine. and they're walking around, and it's unbelievable. So my question for you is, how would you broach that conversation with parents and maintain that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think with parents, the thing that's always the biggest challenge is that parents' first instinct is to protect, naturally, as any parent would, and so it's often takes exposure, I think, and awareness to move out of the, there always needs to be some amount of reasonable and rational protection, but then also moving out towards empowerment. And so, every child who either has a disability acquires a disability at a young age or is born with a disability is going to have a different, have different, potential ultimately. But at the end of the day, I think, especially with parents, exposing to being around other kids and other parents who have done fairly well can be really empowering, and trying to move out of that protection mode into the empowering mode, and optimizing those opportunities along the way. I know that there are a lot of, again, sports is just one example. It could ultimately be something like, music or travel or school, whatever it might be, but opportunities in which there can be a little bit of healthy separation from parents can often be really helpful, because parents themselves also, I think often benefit from being around other parents who have learned how to empower their kids regardless of ability level. And that, I think, brings it down to earth a little bit and takes away a little bit of that fear factor. I know that when I was in California, I worked with a great sports program that was geared towards youth, that actually this was sort of the draconian way, but they told parents that they, for just regular practices, couldn't stay at practice. They actually had to drop their kid off and go, as long as there was no major, health risk. The parents could come, of course, watch the tournaments and games and be supportive, but they almost had to create that bit of separation, at least for a period of time, so that the parents would realize the kid would be okay. They'll be okay. Just, place them in our hands. We'll protect for a period of time and engage them with their peers and have a good time at it. So I think bringing it down to earth and getting over that fear factor is often really important. And often being around other parents who have done well is really critical in that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, my name's Tom Darling. I'm the director of para-rowing for U.S. Rowing, for the national governing body. So I found out about this yesterday, so I'm very happy that I came. Yeah. I'll give a shameless plug in a little while to get all you to come out and try work with our adaptive rowers at community rowing. But another thing I want to say before I ask your question, but I love that Zanardi picture. Yeah. And Zanardi has a great quote where he said, I didn't get on the bike to win. I won because I got on my bike. Mm-hmm. So working with, I have athletes who are arms and shoulders, who are trunk and arms athletes. And in fact, Caitlin Stenk, mm-hmm. who was one of our athletes last year that raced in Amsterdam. She came to a Gateway to Gold event last March, mm-hmm. Got on the rowing ergometer. It was a opportunity to try different sports. And she showed a great propensity for rowing. She's a strong girl. But one of the things we ran into, she won the trials in July, and our world championships were in Amsterdam, was our physicians weren't prepared mm-hmm. to work with the population. Mm-hmm. So we were running into issues with body heat regulation. Mm-hmm. And another athlete who has MS had a flare-up because the time change and the nutrition change and the stress of the thing. So we're working on, and I'd like to talk to you afterwards about preparing our physicians for, emergency situations that would come up at our World Championships. Yeah. Have you, can you give an example of that happened with your wheelchair racing at all? Yeah.
Well, a couple of comments. I think that, you're right on. As we develop this field, so this field, this quote-unquote Paralympic sports medicine, doesn't really exist yet. It needs to exist. And this is exactly why, because athletes are athletes at the end of the day, but there are certainly some nuances for athletes with disabilities. And it's not it's not so complex that it can't be tackled or that people should fear it, but there are some things that are important to know. And that's where, forming collaborations, for example, with IPC and ACSM is huge because, the best way to do it, in my opinion, is to think about like all these team physician training courses that they have. There should be a session, there should be curriculum allocated to the needs of these athletes. As the sport opportunities grow, there will be a point in time in which sports medicine physicians can't opt out because if you're a good physician, it just means you're going to be involved. And so it needs to be a core part of the curriculum. As it relates to different environmental circumstances, I think environmental conditions can be one of the biggest challenges for athletes, especially with neurologic impairment. And we do try to do a lot at the IPC level to educate in advance and try to pick environments that won't be as problematic, although sometimes it just happens. I know that traveling, for me, always traveling was a big portion of it and a big time in which there presented challenges because of that sort of combination of mobility limitations, particularly in air travel, and also trying to optimize your performance as an athlete. And a great example of it is a lot of athletes will kind of purposely dehydrate themselves before a long flight internationally because they don't want to have to use the little aisle chair to go to the lavatory on the plane, which is clearly suboptimal if you're on your way to something like the Paralympic Games or the World Championships, where we tell athletes to do the opposite. We tell them to overhydrate for international air travel because of the recycled air and it being a dehydrating experience in and of itself. So I know that's one that I interfaced with a lot and had to in some ways have a little bit of tough love with myself from the standpoint of no, you actually do need to drink even if you know that it's going to be a bit more of a pain for you or a bit more of an inconvenience during the travel. But that's just one example of many. I think another one that is very specific to athletes with disabilities is just bowel and bladder management for those who have neurologic injuries, which has a lot of considerations in travel as well. Yeah.
So I want to thank you one more time.
Yeah, thank you.